Hey guys, as promised, this is the lecture on birds um, for the week of the 15th, well, the 12th to the 16th. Um, we have two more lectures, basically birds and then mammals, and then we are done. Okay, it's interesting. Birds are really actually that group of animals that probably got me into animals. When I was a kid, I always loved birds, loved to draw them. This is some type of bird of paradise. Um, Check out the videos of these things. This is a male breeding condition. Uh, let's see. Evolution of birds. Check out this cladogram and look at what is the story here. Right. Number one, Archosaurian lineage. This is a group of diapsid reptiles that includes these different types of dinosaurs. The ornithischians, the sauropods. These are like the giant brontosaurids and all these things. And then these group of dinosaurs called the theropods, which includes things like Tyrannosaurus rex and Coelophysis and Velociraptors and these things. And all of these guys go extinct between the Cretaceous and Tertiary, that KT boundary. But there's one group of theropod dinosaurs that lived through the Great Extinction event, and those are the modern birds. And you see this huge expansion, adaptive radiation into all the different types of modern birds, right? Including the eagles over here. Okay, so some neat themes or stories in the story of birds. One is about really this idea of convergent evolution, parallel evolution. There's only two groups of animals that are endothermic. This is, again, thermi meaning heat, and endo from the inside. All the animals we've talked about till now are ectothermic, meaning they get their energy, their heat energy, from the outside. There are two groups of endothermic animals, and that is the birds. Those are the birds and the mammals. But those two, and actually there's a lot of real similar things. Look at four-chambered hearts, endothermy, the most intelligent groups of animals. But these are two different lineages. So this is not a homologous situation. And we're going to talk about pre-adaptations again for flight. But it's interesting to think of which came first, the high metabolic rate that birds have, or insulation, which is in the form of feathers. We tend to think of feathers as being an adaptation for flight, but there's a lot of argument that it was an adaptation for insulation first, and then was sort of co-opted for flight. So birds have very high metabolic rate, and their ancestors were very fast-moving predatory animals, like we'll see, which required a lot of calories to burn, right? Those calories are actually metabolized, oxidized in the mitochondria, and the imperfect conversion of glucose to ATP, right? You lose some heat, and that heat can be captured and used if you have insulation. And so really, again, the thought is the feathers were probably there as insulation, right? Just to make this much more efficient, we can say. Phylogeny of, this is a clade of dinosaurs called dromaeosaurs, all types of theropods. And we see some sort of common, these are like the little things, dromaeosaurs are like the things on Jurassic Park that are running after them. Bipedal, long arms, right? Very similar skeletal structure to things like Archaeopteryx. And then we see these different types of primitive bird ancestors, and then these are the modern birds. But quickly we see the evolution long before the evolution of flight, right? Modern flight didn't happen until here. Back here, these are um, non-flying reptiles, and they had feathers on their wings, right? And even down like feathers. But skeleton you can see as a precursor to modern birds, but at the same time very different. We'll talk about modern bird skeletons and all of the unique adaptations they have. But I guess the point is those a lot of the things we take for granted as being bird-like way predate birds and way predate flight. So that's, to me, that's really the big theme or the big story in this chapter is the evolution of flight. And here's some interesting questions to think about when you're looking through this chapter. And I'm going to point out, if you go to module 5 and look in the birds section, let's see, module 5, there's this, here's another essay question that will be on, this one will be on the final, or exam 5. So watch this movie. It's from Howard Hughes Medical Institute. They have a great series of videos about evolution called Great Transitions. Watch that video, and embedded in that are the answers to these questions, right? I'll talk about some of them as we go through, but largely rely on this video for the answers to that. This is Archaeopteryx, was found, I think, in Germany in the maybe 30s or 40s, and was one of these really important transitional fossils that helped to steer people towards looking for the ancestor of birds in the reptile group, right? And so we see some things that are very reptilian, long tail. This organism had teeth. But there's also some very bird-like type things, right? Including feathers, right? So this suggested that Archaeopteryx was someplace in between a bird and other mammals, right? Here's Archaeopteryx here, sister group to modern birds. But they are, this clade is, related to things like Tyrannosaurus, Allosaurus, and all of these things are in the group of theropod dinosaurs. And again, things that we think are unique to birds, hollow bones, the presence of three digits in the hand, feathers, all those things occurred. Let's see, that we're talking about bones or feathers being present almost 200 million years ago, whereas modern birds didn't appear until 150 million. So 50 million years before modern birds, there were groups of reptiles that had feathers. Right? That's really fascinating to me. Even some social type thing, right? These guys brooded in nests. They laid eggs and provided maternal care, parental care, really, because the fathers also provided care. They probably vocalized. So very bird-like characteristics among the dinosaurs. So here's these things that sort of define a modern bird. Long arms, right? The radius and the ulna, the forearm, very long in modern birds, and again, that is where we're going to see feathers attach. This would be the secondary feathers attached to the ulna, and secondary feathers of the feathers that create lift. The bird's skeleton is designed really to centralize their center of gravity, which is kind of a redundant statement, but center of gravity was brought in towards the middle, reduce the length of the tail That's called the pygostyle. The vertebral column was shortened, right? So that when the wings were flapping, the forewings were flapping, that really it's a very efficient transfer of energy. And so a lot of things like these coracoids, we'll take a look at those. The furcula, this is the wishbone. It's all about this motion of the wings flapping, right? And that is what creates the thrust and lift for flight. Keeled sternum, again, what is the muscle that contracts that brings the wings down? That is the pectoralis muscles. Those have to have a place to attach, and that is the keeled sternum here. Okay, so we're looking at the pectoral girdle here of bird. Here's the hand bones effectively, and here is the forearm bones, radius and ulna, again very elongated, and we're going to see this is where feathers attach. This motion of flapping the wings down, it happens because the pectoralis muscles contract. They're attached to the humerus and they're attached to the sternum, right? And that's basically chicken breast. This is the pectoralis muscle, right? And so when they can shorten, they pull the humerus down, and that creates flapping. The interesting thing is the muscles that act antagonistically that pull the wing arm back up are attached to the front of the bird too, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. You'd think that, like, for us, the muscles on our back, actually, when they contract, they move our arm back. But because of this interesting little coracoid bone here, this muscle, the supracoracoideus muscle, attaches to the sternum, goes up and around the coracoid, and attaches to the humerus here. So when it contracts, it pulls the wing back up. Okay. So this coracoid is there as a leverage for the supracoracoideus muscle. The furcula, the wishbone, is just like a strut that really is there to stabilize this whole apparatus, or this whole area, so that when the muscles are contracting, it, rather than this part sort of being floppy and losing a lot of the energy, that energy is transferred more efficiently straight to the humerus. Okay. So that's the part we just looked at. Here's that coracoid. Here's the furculum, the long ulna, right? But other things in birds, right? Very reduced and lightweight skull, no teeth, right? That's all about stripping weight. Very huge keeled sternum, shortened tail. This is the pygostyle. The vertebral column here is very short. This halix is basically the 3 toes to the front, 1 toe to the back, which allows these animals to grab onto to things when they land. So that's the modern bird skeleton. Let's see. Okay, so then if there are this group of animals that have feathers, they have hollow bones, they have some very sort of pre-adaptive traits that allow them to fly, what would be the evolution for how natural selection would keep pushing these animals in this direction? All right, so again, you can see where being able to fly is adaptive, and we can see how having feathers would be adaptive because it's insulative. Having lightweight hollow bones would be adaptive, but what's going on in between? Right? And so there are 2 competing hypotheses about this, and those are known as the cursorial or the arboreal hypothesis. One says basically that these fast-running theropod dinosaurs would have had an advantage if they had a little lift. So if they could use these feathers to create some lift, then that lift would overcome their mass and the effect of gravity, which would make it easier for them to run fast. And that would have been selected for by evolution, natural selection, and so they would get lighter and lighter, which eventually could lead to full powered flight. Alternatively, another hypothesis is that basically there were these theropod dinosaurs that lived in trees, and it was just much more efficient if they could glide between trees, and they could catch prey by climbing up in a tree and then gliding from one tree, kind of like a flying squirrel. Flying squirrels are not actually flying, they're gliders. They can't generate lift. They more can reduce the falling to the point where they can sort of move from tree to tree. And so, again, it probably had to do with capturing prey, being able to jump further and further. And so this is, again, competing hypotheses, the story of science, right? Evidence points towards this, evidence points towards that. Which one has the highest bulk of evidence wins out. But, and oftentimes we see it's not one or the other. This may have happened a couple times. But there's a lot of really neat fossils that have been turning up, particularly in China, that are shedding a lot of light on this. And I think they're discussed a little bit in that movie for the essay question. Regardless, it happened. We have flying birds. 12 kilos, what is that? Maybe like, I don't know, 6 to 8 pounds? No, wait, no, it's probably more than that. I'm not really into the whole kilos thing. So let's see. This would be something like I think that the albatross is the heaviest, or maybe some type of like a swan or something. 12 kilograms, 2 pounds. I never remember. Yeah, 26 pounds. So kilos, like 2 pounds. So these are big. It's a pretty big animal. But ostriches obviously are more like 300 pounds. So this just points to the fact that you can only achieve a certain mass and be able to fly at the same time. That definitely limits the size of birds. Feathers, where did they come from? Just like teeth came from placoid scales, just like jaws came from gill arch supports, just like lungs came from swim bladders. There's always, the story is always the something that's pre-adapted, it's something that's there, is tweaked and changed, right? And so the story here is that feathers are made of this type of protein called keratin, which is basically the same type of keratin that reptile scales. And I'm saying reptiles here because really we've seen birds are really a type of reptile, but other reptilian scales, like something like a lizard or a snake, their scales are made of the same exact material as feathers. And in fact, there are plenty of examples where the same genes that code for scales, say like on a chicken leg, can be turned into feathers, right? And you get these really weird looking chickens that I'll show you a picture of one. These guys are weird. I think they're called colchin chicken. Cochin, that's what it is. Check out their feet. This is the weird, freaky thing, right? So chickens, damn it, normally have scales down here, right? But the cochin has feathers. So, i.e., a genetic mutation for the genes that make the scales on the feet leads to code that makes a feather, right? So that's how mutations work. That's how evolution and natural selection work, is that this organism's body used to be covered by scales. There was a tweak in the instructions for those scales, and that led to feathers, Right? That's the point of that story. Um, feathers, let's see, um, have multiple functions. And we'll look at the structure of them here, but we'll see some of them are about making a contour or a shape of the bird, and some of them are there to provide insulation. Right, so we can see here some different types of feathers. We have these fuzzy ones, like these are down feathers that are there to trap heated air next to the body and provide insulation. So think of a down jacket. The reason that they're so warm is because of this fuzziness. It will trap air. Here's the rachis. Here's the barbs, and then there's these little barbules that come out. On those barbules, there's these little hooks that hold the feather together. I don't have a good feather in here. A crappy feather here. It's been eaten up. But you can see on this feather that the barbs stick together, and you can pull them apart, right? But then those barbules, the little hooks that we see shown here, right? Those little hooks will hook the barbs back together, and it makes a nice smooth contour again. So different functions, different types of feathers. Contour feathers are these ones that are on the outside of the body, and they are there to, again, basically make a smooth shape, reduce drag. Semi-plumes are sort of in between a contour feather and a down feather. Down feathers are small, they're very fluffy. And then there's these more specialized type of feathers. One's called a bristle. Those you can find in things like probably on boblets, and Friday night we'll certainly hear some type of a goat sucker bird, like a whippoorwill or a Chuck-Will's widow. They have bristles all around their eyes. See here, those little bristles here, right? And they're sensory. They help the bird to catch insects as it's flying around. And then, so this would be like a down feathers. This would be a semi-plume. Down on the bottom, it's kind of like a mullet. Down on the bottom and contour on the top. And this would be like, what do they call these? Phyloplumes, which are very interesting sensory type of feathers that are there to determine like wind speed, pressure, things like that. And so that's a really specialized type of feather. Phyloplume. Okay, feathers and wings and flight. Slide out puts all this together. We have, this would be the metacarpals of the skeleton, and this would be the ulna of the skeleton. And the feathers that attach onto the ulna are called secondary feathers. The feathers that attach onto the metacarpals are called primary feathers. The primary feathers here are more involved with generating thrust. The secondary feathers shown in blue here are there to provide lift. Okay, and so these are the two main things that a bird needs to generate in order to fly. Okay, so we think about the physical forces at play here. We have gravity pulling down, and we have drag pulling backwards. Okay, so all things being equal, a bird's not going to fly because gravity's pushing down, right, and drag is pulling back. So they use thrust to push forward based on the primary feathers, and then they use the air flowing over the secondary feathers to provide lift. Okay, and so very similar to it's the same, it's called the Bernoulli principle. It's a very similar principle to a airplane wing. And if you guys, most of you guys have probably flown on an airplane, and when you're landing on an airplane, check out when the airplane is coming down and slows down. So when the airplane is going 600 miles an hour, there's enough air flowing over that wing to generate enough lift to keep the airplane in the air. But when the plane is coming down, it has to slow down in order to land, and as it slows down, there's less air flowing over, and so what they do is they put these big flaps down, very similar to a secondary feather. What that does is it accentuates the shape. The shape of a wing is basically on the bottom it's flat and it's rounded on the top. Okay, and the way that that generates lift is air hits the front end of the leading edge of the wing at the same time this air does that flows from the bottom, and the air that flows over the top starts at the same place here, ends at the same place there. Because this air has further to travel because of the shape of the wing than this air, the air on the top of the wing travels faster. Okay, say that again. Air, because it has further to go, has to travel faster over the top of the wing, and that creates negative low pressure and creates lift. Another way to that somebody explained this to me, which I found was helpful, was if you ever been driving down the road and you're going 70 miles an hour and then a big rig going like 80 miles an hour goes by you, it's the same effect. What happens is that pulls you over, sort of creates a lift in that direction because that air is moving faster on that side of your car. And so that's how bird wings work, right? Is that shape accentuated by the contour feathers on the secondary contour feathers. So all different, there's a bunch of, obviously many species, thousands of species of birds. They have different niches, they have different ways of making a living. And so the shape of wings is related to that. We can kind of, this is not perfect groups where you can say like every bird falls into one of these groups, but these are just sort of 4 helpful classifications for the shape of a wing, and that will tell you a little bit about the job of that bird that has that type of wing. Okay, so the 4 types: dynamic soaring, elliptical, high aspect ratio, and high lift. Dynamic soaring, right? These are for birds that just generate a ton of lift. They don't really need to generate thrust because they live, these birds, albatrosses, shearwaters, it turns out that because they live usually over the water in the ocean and there's a lot of wind there, the wind blowing over the wing gives them enough thrust and enough lift that they rarely even flap their wings, right? That's what soaring is, right? Elliptical wings, sort of, to me, on the opposite end of the spectrum. Lots of wing flapping, but you have really lots of thrust. So highly maneuverable, short and powerful. So these are things like grouse, quail. I don't know if you've ever seen these birds. If you're walking through the woods and a quail or a grouse takes off, they can just explode from the ground with thrust and up into the air. Something like albatross, it's very difficult actually for them to get off of the ground. They usually live on cliffs, and they sort of have to jump off the cliff and get into flight that way. So this is all about lift. This one's all about thrust. High aspect ratio is for things like swifts, swallows, kites. These are very fast moving, sort of like the jet fighter plane. And then high lift wings, I think, are sort of really a mix of all of these things, right? So let's look at the shape of these things. Dynamic soaring, again, all about lift. So they have really lots of secondary feathers. Elliptical wings are all about the thrust, and they have lots of primary feathers. And then high lift is sort of, again, form equals function. We have a lot of lift and a lot of thrust. This is things like a hawk that can be maneuverable, but yet they do a lot of soaring too. And then here's your little jet fighter plane. Something like this is some type of a swallow, like got our friend the turkey vulture, um, albatross, bobwhite quail. Albatrosses are amazing. I mean, these birds uh, may go for months and months without ever landing. Um, so that tells you that they sleep when they're flying. They lock their wings um, into place. They go to sleep with one of their hemispheres of their brain, and they just are up there in the atmosphere, just cruising along. Pretty amazing. So a lot of the body of a bird is about being streamlined. The contour feathers making a smooth surface to reduce drag, but even their physiology it relates to flight, right? And a lot of this goes back to again that really high metabolic rate. It takes a lot of energy to create powered flight, and so a lot of energy requires a lot of ATP, and a lot of ATP requires was the inputs for respiration is glucose and oxygen. So this requires a very high throughput of oxygen. Okay, and so this is pretty amazing. I'm always sort of uh, blown away by this. And so the next slide will show you this to a degree, but we have what's called tidal respiration in our lungs. So when we're breathing in, we're getting oxygen-rich air. But when we're breathing out, we're just getting rid of that carbon dioxide, right? So we're really, half the time we're getting oxygen. And when I'm talking the whole time, I'm like sort of talking a little bit, breathing in, so on and so forth. Birds have what's called unidirectional flow in their lungs. So basically, in inhaling and exhaling, there is oxygen-rich air moving through their lungs, right? So breathing in, getting oxygen. Breathing out, getting oxygen. Breathing in, so they're constantly, some parts of their lungs are getting uh, um, good oxygenated air, right? So, and I'll show you this. Okay, so there's their lung, okay, where the absorption of the oxygen comes in. But attached to the lungs are they're called uh, parabronchial or like accessory, what do we call those? So like accessory lungs or pouches. A lot of them are actually in the hollow bones of the birds. And these little reservoirs, what they do is when the air is breathed in, some of the air goes into the air sacs. When they breathe out, that will push air from the air pouches into the lungs. When they breathe in, the air pouches are filled, and some of that air from the pouches also goes in through the lungs. As they breathe out, the rest of the air from the pouches is pushed through the lungs. So I guess the big point here is this arrow is about good oxygenated air moving through the lungs and being absorbed into the blood. And inspiration and expiration, right, both has a nice blue arrow. So that's a very unique bird adaptation. That's all about more O2 to oxidize more glucose. So the glucose side of this, pretty efficient, fast digestion. Birds have this crop, which is basically a pouch on the esophagus, and it's there to store food so that even when they're not actively eating, they have this little crop and they can take food out of their crop and then pass that down into their stomach, right, for digestion. So it's like kind of like there's no real analogy with humans, but it would be like having some tater tots in your pocket, and you can just at the cafeteria anymore, you can just reach in your pocket and get some tots, right? Um, Stomach has both enzymatic and mechanical digestion. Um, Food goes from the crop in here, mixed with enzymes and acids. It helps to chemically cleave the food up. It moves back into the gizzard, which is very muscular, just like in the earthworm. But this is a homoplasia structure, but the muscular portion of the stomach often has some kind of gritty stuff like rocks in there. And so this basically serves the same function as the mouth and teeth. It sort of like masticates the food. It mechanically grinds that food up with the enzymes, and then it's passed into the um, intestine where digestion is completed, and most importantly, the absorption of those nutrients. Uh, Common story again, Sika, little pouches for bacteria that help any type of herbivorous or omnivorous bird break down cellulose. Um, Bird beak modifications. You can really look at a bird and say what they eat, right? Ducks have almost like a baleen, these little strips in their beak that allows them to filter out food particles and get rid of water. Things like a sandpiper. We were at the beach last weekend and I saw these little plovers or sandpipers. When the waves go out, they run down to the beach, down to the exposed sand, and they use their little probing beaks to get these little probably mollusks or arthropods out of the sand. Woodcock is really an extreme example of this. We'll probably hear woodcocks at boblets, but they have this long beak, almost like with the two little lips at the end that they use to probe down and grab earthworms. Insects, cracking seeds, tearing meat, drilling holes. Woodpeckers have just mind-boggling adaptations. They have this long tongue that can snake down into the hole and grab insects. They have sort of cushions in their skull to avoid getting concussions. So some amazing adaptations um, birds have. Because they fly, right, they need to be very adept at receiving sensory input and interpreting it and responding to it, right? Most birds can see very well, um, and they can hear very well, but few birds can smell at all, right? Things like turkey vultures can smell. Most birds cannot smell. So the idea that, don't touch that baby bird because the mom's going to smell it is just another lie that your parents told you because they don't want you to bring a bird home. Almost 10,000 species. They diverged 180 million years ago from these theropod dromaeosaurs. They're found everywhere, right? They're easily dispersed across barriers. I mean, that's a sort of understatement. Those shearwaters were referred to as one of the dynamic soaring wings. They'll move millions of miles in their lifetime. There are birds that migrate from one pole to the other and back and forth every year, right? It's just amazing animals. Birds are, right? The rest of this is FYI. Right? I don't get into the ordinal. These are order level taxonomy of birds. Falconiformes, red-tailed hawk, kestrel or merlin. Here's a turkey vulture. Griformes, sandhill cranes fly over in the spring and the winter. This is a rail, coot, killdeer. You guys know killdeers. I'm sure you can hear them say, killdeer, killdeer. They lay their eggs just in a gravel parking lot over by the gym. They'll lay their eggs in that little gravel parking lot. The mom will see you coming and she'll pretend like she's got a broken wing and lead you away from the nest. Black-headed gull. All the gulls are in this order. The owls, barred owl, barred, B-A-R-R-E-D, barred owl. Barn owls. We have great horned owls, saw-whet owls. Here's the Caprimulgiforme. Capricorn, these are goat. These are the goat suckers. They had this giant mouth. Actually, and there's those bristles that we referred to earlier. These things have such a big mouth that they actually will eat uh, other birds as they're flying around eating insects. And I think they probably do it purposefully. Apodiformes, chimney swift, ruby-throated hummingbirds, piciformes. This would be like the red-headed uh, flickers, pileated woodpeckers. Passeriformes, huge order. Chickadees, titmice, nuthatch, barn swallow, blue jay, American robin. Very diverse group of animals. Carolina wren. This is Georgia state bird. Brown thrasher. This is the waxwings, the warblers, the shrikes, vireos, tanagers, cardinals, meadowlarks, indigo bunting. Amazing. So we're going to see a lot of birds on Saturday the 24th. Here's 3 extinct birds. This is, I think, Bachman's warbler or Kirtland's warbler. Did not occur here in Georgia, but Coneropsis carolinensis. This is the Carolina parakeet. Used to live certainly probably right here in Cherokee County. We had our own parakeet, but they were not wise to people with guns, and the European people just killed them all, made hats out of them. This is the passenger pigeon. There used to be so many here that they would blacken the sky. Even right here in Alaska, there were billions of these birds, all killed one by one. And they used to just use nets to catch as many as they could, and yeah, extinct. So birds face their own sort of conservation challenges too. And that's it. That's birds.